So you're very welcome to Nano Nagle Place. I'm Daniel O'Donovan, and today we're going to celebrate and discuss this gorgeous new book, Irish Country Furniture and Furnishings 1700 to 2000, written by Claudia Kinmonth. It's so appropriate that Claudia's here. She's been a huge friend to our museum because we happen to hold a lot of very ordinary items, and Claudia's given us curatorial advice on looking after them. So the first question, Claudia, how did you get your taste for the ordinary?
Gosh, my taste for the ordinary. Thank you very much, Danielle. It's great to be here. I don't think it's ordinary. I think it's extraordinary. I think our own heritage in Ireland has been neglected for too long. And when I was studying at the Royal College of Art, I wanted a subject that hadn't been done before, and I realised that nobody seemed to have studied the Irish farmhouse as a subject for design history. Mm-hmm. So I knew a bit about it, having been brought up coming here. And that's where it began. I realised that there was all sorts of interesting material for brand new research, an unploughed field. So that's where it started, as a thesis subject, MA thesis subject.
I think I heard you saying elsewhere that you used to love to go to the creamery on the back of a milk cart.
Yes, that's right. Well, my father was from County Clare, and so my grandparents lived in Cork, so we came here every Easter, every summer, and my greatest treat was to go running up to the farm at 8 o'clock every morning and jump on the back of the cart and go to the creamery. So I could see the way the farmers were working. I sometimes went into the farmhouses, and I had a great love of that whole life, which very quickly changed as I was a child. But yeah, I was familiar with the Irish farmhouse always.
I suppose actually seeing that change over time probably is an impetus to kind of record it as well, because I was thinking, you started your research in the late 80s when actually there were far more of the Irish traditional farmhouses around, and since then I suppose it's a little bit of a story of loss. So I hate to say this is a work for posterity, but there's something there, is there?
Well, even in 1988, when I began that work as a thesis subject, that there were elderly historians saying to me, "Oh, you won't find anything, it's all gone." So that just added to my determination. But it was a lot of work travelling all around Ireland. I went to every county of Ireland, knocking on doors, continuously finding nothing, that the dresser had gone, that the settle had changed and was no longer there, but actually finding enough material to be the basis of a lot of work, which has excited me ever since. And some of the houses I went into, there were mainly elderly people who hadn't modernised things, who were living, some without electricity, some without running water. Still, it seems extraordinary. It was extraordinary even then. So I was seeking out this particular stubborn old breed, very often unmarried people who hadn't changed their houses at all.
And it's kind of a story. I mean, I'm kind of from West Cork myself, and there was definitely a move in the 80s to build a bungalow next to the farmhouse and to just live an easier life, because I think we can romanticise it, can we, a little?
Yes, it's a mistake to romanticise it. I can understand people wanting to move out. I mean, I think historically, and the book isn't really just about photographs that I took in the late 1980s. It's, as a historian, it's much more about the long continuum going right back to the 17th century. But traditionally, the Irish kitchen was the workshop of the woman, and that woman had to work very, very hard if she didn't have running water and if she didn't have electricity to try and keep big families clean and fed and warm and healthy. And it's totally understandable if by the 20th century people were moving away from that as fast as they possibly could. It was a life of drudgery for many.
I know your research has continued, so you're still on the lookout for the great dresser and the amazing gloss paint. How do you find things now? I'm fascinated to know, do you have a nose for 20 layers of gloss, like all on top of each other, which seems to be like the classic Irish farmhouse?
Well, do I have a nose for it? Yes, I suppose I do, and people tell me about it. They do, and I have this. Whenever I bring out a book, it's after the book's come out that people say, "Oh, if I knew that you were doing that work, I'd have shown you this." But people have been showing me relevant interiors for a long time. So coming back to a subject quarter of a century later, or 30 years later, it's been interesting to find that actually the museums, which 30 years ago hadn't necessarily collected things with all the information that needed to go with them, had collected an awful lot more since I first published the subject. And it's great to see things being looked after better. And that's important too, because I think it's a really important part of our heritage. You know, the dresser and the farmhouse. The farmhouse itself needs more protection in Ireland. It's not, you know, there aren't enough grants to look after those vernacular houses. And when you find a farmhouse that's got all its intact furniture, it's much greater than the sum of its parts. It's an amazing thing to see how it fitted in properly. Those objects weren't designed in isolation. They were designed to do a job. They were nearly always highly functional. So, yes, it's very interesting to see them intact. And the Ulster Folk Museum, where I'm a curator at the moment, has got some fantastic interiors, you know, reconstructed farmhouses. And that's the best way to see things, is in the folk park situation, next to the turf fire, smelling the bread being baked in the vestibule and seeing everything glinting on the dresser across from the fire.
Well, I've visited some of the folk parks and they are stunning. And I suppose that actually the book might be an impetus for people who do know of an interior to come and let you know, because you're always collecting, I think.
Well, I'm not so much collecting, but I'm still photographing. I try not to be collecting. But yes, I'm always interested to know about rare things, for sure. Yes, it's an interest that's always there.
It's an interesting point you make about everything in the farmhouse having to have a function, because, you know, as we kind of move towards a world where we need to be sustainable and where we need to not have, you know, so much plastic in our home, some of the things you speak about in this book, like the noggin, are items that have multiple functions and are quite kind of made of natural materials.
Yes, I think there's a sense of frugality looking at how we lived. You know, lots of houses were quite poor, so they made a lot of what they did have. They didn't have an awful range of things, but each thing seemed to be functional. So, you know, instead of having many objects that did several different things, we'd have one object that would do all those jobs. For example, you'd have an earthenware crock, which would be used for washing your vegetables, would be washed up and then used for washing your hands, or, you know, for putting the milk in when you're setting your cream in the summer. You know, it would have lots of functions rather than having many objects doing all those separate things. So there were fewer things and better things, really, and they were looked after terribly well. There was, you know, nothing was thrown away. For example, if the wheel on your cart wore out, which it did eventually, it would be dismantled and the spokes would be rebuilt to make a ladder. The outside curve pieces, the felloes, would often end up being the rockers for the cradle. The central hub would end up being a seat. You know, so every single little thing was reused and had a new life. There was an amazing sense of let's keep it rather than ever throwing anything away. So there was lots of repairing and restoring, and you can see that with the objects. It's wonderful to see how things have been kept going.
I suppose the one place where there was clutter is the dresser, and there are some stunning pictures of dressers in the book. Tell us a little bit about the Irish dresser.
Well, I suppose if somebody was fortunate enough to have a really good dresser, I mean, a big farmhouse with a good dresser would display things really beautifully. But I mean, even in the 18th century, people like Arthur Young, who travelled around Ireland in the 1770s, said that the dresser was beautifully displayed, but there were broken teacups wisely kept for show. So things with cracks would be turned around, and if you look really closely, the back of a jug might be damaged, but the front would be on display. So things were very, very carefully displayed to look really, really good, but not necessarily, things weren't necessarily being bought and replenished. And I think lots of dressers have got a sense of history. You know, there are precious things that have been kept that are hardly ever used. And some people used to say, what was on display on the dresser was to be looked at and to be handed down to the next generation, not to be used, which is a nice idea.
We definitely have ware in our house that was handed down to be put on the dresser, and we have the names like, that's Tim Jack's dish, don't touch it, don't break it, that's Tim Jack's. So I'm sure there's loads of stories like that around the country.
Yes, and then there's a hidden thing which seemed to have been forgotten, which I discovered in paintings, which is if people were lucky enough to have spoons, and they wouldn't necessarily have very many spoons, you know, an inventory might mention 7 spoons in a house for a whole household. They had little slots that they were hung on at eye level on the dresser, on display. And it's worth people examining their dressers to see if they've got these little slots behind the shelf, whether the spoons would be hung absolutely vertically in slots, and they're nearly always forgotten. And whenever I go into a farmhouse and somebody asks me to look at the dresser, I look for the spoon slots, and a lot of the time they're there, forgotten. and they can be rediscovered.
So it's interesting, isn't it, that even spoons had a kind of a status about them, that a household just might not have that many. In a world where we can go to TK Maxx and buy a set of cutlery a week, it's kind of shocking.
Yes, there's so much excess now. It's really hard to imagine how careful people were with things. And spoons made of cow horn were listed in inventories, and they were lovely. You know, after the cow died, the horns would be kept. There was an elaborate craft, the horner, you know, he made all sorts of wonderful things: drinking horns, drenching horns, sounding horns, and spoons. And I focused on spoons to look at the way these horn spoons were made. And of course, they were very smooth on the lips. They were very beautiful and iridescent. They couldn't be used for cooking because they couldn't stand a lot of heat. But they were a precious thing. A horn spoon was a precious thing.
I love the way you're talking about craftspeople, actually. You know, you have the tinsmith and you have the cooper, and you have these people who, you don't only buy your items from them, do you? It's like a relationship. I mean, they're going to keep looking after these items. There's no planned obsolescence here. That's
right. The cooper would travel around the country. He was the barrel maker or the cask maker, and he made all sorts of white cooper, wet cooperage and dry cooperage, barrels for tea or for apples or for gunpowder, and then also barrels for liquids. And he'd come around all the farms every year, and if you had something that needed to be mended that he'd produced a few years before, he'd fix it for you, and that was what was expected, that he'd keep things going and he'd mend things. And it was the same with the tinker. You know, the tinsmith would mend anything that needed to be mended, and he would be fed and looked after at the same time as that work was going on, just like the boat builder was accommodated when he was building you a boat. So there was definitely a relationship going on with all these craftspeople.
So different from today, isn't it?
Very different, and I suppose people were a lot more isolated, so the sense of somebody's arriving, he's going to work for a day or two, he's going to bring the news and he'll be fed, and you know, there was a symbiosis there. You know, the people living in remote places really needed that company as well.
So there's kind of, we've talked about items that you use, and functional items like spoons and your lovely noggin. But you talk in the book about this idea of reusing things. I know we now have our reduce, reuse, recycle, but actually there was an amazing tradition of people using different objects which were maybe a bit ephemeral, but which had this whole new life within the farmhouse.
Yes, I think things really weren't thrown away at all. I mean, one thing which comes up again and again, well, a couple of things, the flour bag and the butter box, and they're very 20th century things. But by the time the creameries started to abandon the use of barrels or firkins by about 1900, they started to use these little square pine crates, which were the original flat pack, actually. They'd be put together by the creamery, branded, and then the butter would be packed. 56 pounds of butter would be put in them, and they'd be sent out, and the butter would be marketed. And after they were used, they were then reused by many people, and they were turned into seats. So these little tapered square boxes were either turned upside down, like a little pyramid with the seat on top, or the other way up, they'd be wider at the top, and then the lid would be hinged. Very often they were completely covered in different material, totally disguised, and inside might be a wonderful sewing box with pockets and lining and a sprung seat on the top. And these were ubiquitous. They were by every single fire. Every fireplace seemed to have this container that you sat on next to it. And Eric Cross's book, The Tailor and Anstey, published in 1944, describes how he called his cornucopia. All sorts of good things came tumbling out of it, and every few years it would collapse and he'd replace it. So the butter box lives on in people's memories, and the flour bag as well. The flour bag would be bought by the housewife. The thrifty housewife would make her own bread. She'd buy a large sack of flour, and when she'd finished the sack, she'd scour all the print off it very carefully and turn it beautifully white, and then use those sacks. She'd unpick it, she'd reuse the thread. It would be used for everything from aprons to tea towels to pillowcases, the backs of quilts. Apparently 4 sacks would make a really good double sheet. And they're very soft and very fine. And there was a miller in Cork, KB Williams, who printed on his sacks, print will scrub off. So he knew that this was a very good selling point to the housewife. She knew that she'd be able to get it white afterwards. And they even lined the ceilings of the open thatched roofs with flour bags and whitewashed them to keep them light and dust-free.
We've talked about kind of simple items being used as furniture, like the butter box. In fact, in our collection, we have a very simple item, which you were so excited about when you saw it, and which I was so relieved about because it's been slightly difficult in an interpretive sense to talk about because it's so very unusual. Claudia, can you tell us about Nano Nagle's stool?
Yes, it was so exciting the first time I came here to find this sort of rather unassuming looking object in a case, in a corner, which at first glance looks very much like a piece of ham with string wrapped around it. It's a solid block of wood about this size. And it turns out that it was a stool used by Nano Nagle. And Nano Nagle was teaching in Cork in very poor situations, in little cabins with earthen floors, between about 1750 and her death, 1784. So this stool is supposed to have been her stool, and there's no reason why it shouldn't have been. It's ended up in the collection. And it seems to me, I imagine, that she probably had decent clothes on, she was teaching children, and she wanted something she could carry, and that she could put down on the floor, and then she could crouch down and be close to the children. I imagine them looking over her shoulder as she's reading a book to them. She'd be low off the ground, and it would keep her clothes clean. Earthen floors are notoriously dusty and muddy in the winter. So this little block stool might have been one of the only things that she carried, other than perhaps some books. And I would imagine her carrying it from place to place, and it's become completely worn and rounded, and it's even got burn holes in it. And yet I can tell, looking at it, that it was made by somebody using a pole lathe, which is a very primitive form of pre-electric wood turning, out of a solid block of green timber. And he's put in decorative lines. I think there are 8 or 9 incised lines, and then it's been painted lots of times. So it's got these traces of blue and pink and brown paint still on it, and yet it's incredibly worn. And actually, it is the earliest datable stool in my book. It's very hard to find a stool pre-famine at all. So this block stool, which I've read about in texts from many other places, exists as the earliest seat illustrated in the book, figure 44. And it's a really wonderful thing.
I suppose it's because it had that association with nano. I mean, if I'd got a better stool, I wouldn't have sat on that stool. It doesn't look like the most comfortable thing, Claudia. I would have had that on the fire, which I suppose is what happened, the fate of...
Yeah, it has got these big burn holes, so it's interesting you should say I'd have had it on the fire. It's certainly you wouldn't lounge around on it. You'd have to be perched on it. You're crouching. It's not much bigger than a biscuit tin in size. And it's interesting, the whole business of celebrities owning things allow them to exist through time. So I also illustrate a chair that John Wesley, the preacher, sat on when he was preaching in the north of Ireland, and that exists because he sat on it. And then there's also one of the things I illustrate in the book is a deck chair that came from the deck of the Lusitania, which was sunk in 1915. Now that deck chair wouldn't have been kept had it not been for that extraordinary tragic event. So, you know, important people and important events allow objects to survive, and they become conversation pieces in their own right. So Nano Nagle's stool is wonderful and important, even though it's a very humble thing, and many other ones of the same type would have just been jettisoned and used to light the fire, like you say.
Well, for a history of lots of humble objects that are so well discussed and sort of brought to life, Claudia, I don't think there's any better book. Irish Country Furniture and Furnishings, 1700 to 2000. It's Cork University Press. It's available in all good bookshops, but it's also available in the best bookshop here at Nano Nagle Place. I'm never not selling. And we now have a web shop, so you can buy it online. So please, if you're thinking of a Christmas present, it's the most sumptuous and wonderful book. Claudia, thanks for talking to us today.
Thank you.